Whitney Houston's arms wrapped around the 84-year-old veteran's frail shoulders as he sobbed silently into her chest. It was the first human touch Sergeant Frank Peterson had felt in 3 years, and he hadn't said a word in 20. But what happened next would prove that sometimes the greatest healing comes not from medicine, but from the simple power of a voice that refuses to give up on the human spirit. If you've ever witnessed the healing power of music, or if you know a veteran who's struggling, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this story with someone who needs to hear about hope when all seems lost. November 15th, 1991. The East Orange VA Medical Center in New Jersey was having its worst week in recent memory. 3 veteran suicides in 10 days, budget cuts threatening essential programs, and a growing sense among the staff that they were losing the war against invisible wounds that never seemed to heal. It was into this atmosphere of despair that Whitney Houston walked, unannounced and unrecognized, carrying nothing but a worn gospel hymn book and a determination to do something, anything to help. She hadn't planned to visit that day. Whitney had been driving through Newark after visiting her childhood church when she'd seen the VA hospital sign and felt an inexplicable pull to stop. Something about the timing felt important. Her father John had always taught her to respect the men and women who'd served their country, and with the Gulf War just ending and veterans returning home to inadequate care, Whitney felt called to use her platform for something bigger than entertainment. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the hospital's chief PTSD specialist, was skeptical when the young woman with the beautiful voice introduced herself in the lobby. "Ma'am, we appreciate celebrity visits, but our patients aren't really in condition for autographs and photo opportunities," she'd said, not immediately recognizing the biggest pop star in the world standing in front of her. "I'm not here for photos," Whitney replied quietly. "I'm here because I think music might be able to reach places that medicine can't. Do you have any patients who've been resistant to traditional therapy?" Dr. Martinez paused, studying Whitney's face. There was something genuine in her eyes, something that went beyond the usual celebrity charity photo op motivation. "Actually," she said slowly, "there is one man who might benefit from what you're suggesting. But I have to warn you, he's a very difficult case." That's when Dr. Martinez led Whitney to a room that would change both their lives forever. Room 314 was at the end of the psychiatric ward's longest hallway. Through the small window, Whitney could see an elderly man sitting perfectly upright in a wheelchair by the window, his posture so rigid it looked almost military. Despite his age and frail appearance, there was something unmistakably strong about the way he held himself, as if decades of training had made proper bearing as natural as breathing. "Sergeant Frank Peterson," Dr. Martinez said softly, 84 years old, served in Korea from 1950 to 1953, then volunteered for Vietnam from 1969 to 1971. He was 42 when he went to Vietnam, older than most of the boys he served with. Came back with what we now recognize as severe PTSD, but back then, they just called it being shell-shocked and told him to get over it. Whitney watched the old man through the window. He never moved, just stared out at the parking lot with an expression that seemed to see something far beyond the present moment. "He hasn't spoken a word in 20 years, Dr. Martinez continued. Not to me, not to the nurses, not to his daughter who used to visit until she gave up 3 years ago. He responds to basic commands. He eats when food is put in front of him, but it's like he's trapped inside himself. We've tried every therapy, every medication. Nothing reaches him." "What happened 20 years ago?" Whitney asked. "What made him stop talking?" Dr. Martinez consulted her chart. His wife died in 1971, right after he returned from Vietnam. Cancer. He blamed himself for not being home during her illness. That's when the selective mutism started. He would only speak when directly asked questions about his service. Then, in 1971, 20 years ago exactly, he just stopped altogether. The day was November 15th. Whitney felt a chill run down her spine. November 15th, today's date. 20 years to the day since Frank Peterson had last used his voice. "Doctor," Whitney said quietly, "I'd like to meet him." But nothing could have prepared Whitney for what she saw when she walked into that room. Frank Peterson's room was sparse, almost military in its precision. The bed was made with hospital corners so sharp they could cut glass. His few personal belongings were arranged with mathematical precision on the nightstand. But what caught Whitney's attention immediately was the small wooden box sitting next to his water glass. Through the slightly open lid, she could see the glint of military medals. "Hello, Sergeant Peterson," Whitney said softly, approaching his wheelchair. "My name is Whitney Houston. I'm here because I heard you might like some music." Frank didn't turn from the window, didn't acknowledge her presence in any way. His hands, weathered and marked with age spots, rested perfectly still on the arms of his wheelchair. But Whitney noticed something the doctors had missed. His fingers were positioned as if he were holding drumsticks, and they were moving in a subtle rhythm, tapping out a beat only he could hear. Whitney pulled up the visitor's chair and sat beside him. "You know what, Sergeant? I can see you're listening to something. Music lives in all of us, doesn't it? Even when we can't find our voices, the rhythm keeps going." Still no response. But Whitney was patient. She opened her hymn book and began to hum softly. Not any particular song, just a gentle melody that came from somewhere deep in her soul. It was the kind of humming her mother Sissy had done when Whitney was little and couldn't sleep. The kind that wrapped around you like a warm blanket and made you feel safe. After about 10 minutes of gentle humming, something extraordinary happened. Frank's fingers stopped their silent drumming. For the first time in 3 years, according to Dr. Martinez, he turned his head away from the window. His eyes, pale blue and cloudy with age, focused on Whitney's face with startling intensity. "There you are," Whitney whispered. "I knew you were in there." What happened next was something that no amount of medical training could have prepared Dr. Martinez to witness. Without thinking, responding to an instinct deeper than professional boundaries, Whitney reached out and placed her hand gently on Frank's arm. The moment she touched him, the elderly veteran's carefully maintained military composure completely crumbled. 20 years of suppressed grief, guilt, and trauma erupted in a sound unlike anything anyone in that hospital had ever heard. Frank Peterson began to cry. Not the quiet tears of sadness, but the deep, wrenching sobs of a man whose heart had been broken for decades and was finally allowing itself to feel again. His frail body shook with the force of emotions too long denied, and without hesitation, Whitney rose from her chair and wrapped her arms around him. "It's okay," she whispered, holding him as he collapsed against her shoulder. "It's okay to cry. It's okay to hurt. You've been carrying this alone for so long, but you don't have to anymore." Dr. Martinez, watching from the doorway, had never seen anything like it. This man who hadn't responded to years of therapy, who had shut himself off from all human contact, was allowing himself to be comforted by a complete stranger. But as she watched Whitney hold him with such natural compassion, Dr. Martinez realized that maybe Frank hadn't needed a doctor. Maybe he just needed someone who could see past the silence to the soul that was still alive underneath. Frank cried for nearly an hour, and Whitney held him through all of it, occasionally humming softly or whispering words of comfort. Nurses and other staff members gathered quietly in the hallway, drawn by the sound of grief finally being released. Many of them were crying too, recognizing in Frank's sobs the pain of every veteran they'd ever tried to help. When the tears finally subsided, Frank slowly pulled back from Whitney's embrace and looked directly into her eyes. For the first time in 20 years, his mouth opened as if to speak, but only a whisper of air emerged, the vocal cords rusty from decades of disuse. Whitney smiled and took both of his hands in hers. "Don't worry about words right now," she said gently. "Sometimes music speaks louder than words anyway. Do you remember any songs from when you were young?" That's when Frank did something that made everyone in that hallway gasp in amazement. Frank's head began to move almost imperceptibly, a tiny nodding motion that grew stronger as Whitney started humming "Amazing Grace." It was barely visible at first, just the slightest movement in time with the melody. But as Whitney's voice grew stronger, so did Frank's response. His shoulders began to relax from their rigid military posture, his breathing deepened, and something that might have been recognition flickered in his eyes. "I was lost, but now am found," Whitney sang softly, and Frank's lips began to move. No sound emerged, but he was mouthing the words. Muscle memory from a lifetime of church attendance taking over, where conscious thought had long since retreated. "Was blind, but now I see," Whitney continued, and suddenly, like a dam bursting after 20 years of pressure, sound emerged from Frank Peterson's throat. It was rough, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakably singing. Amazing grace, he croaked, his voice like sandpaper after 2 decades of silence. How sweet the sound. Dr. Martinez dropped her clipboard. Nurses in the hallway began crying openly, and Whitney, tears streaming down her own face, continued singing with the old soldier whose voice had finally found its way home. But that wasn't the most incredible part of the story. As Frank's voice grew stronger with each verse, other veterans in the psychiatric ward began to emerge from their rooms. Men who hadn't shown interest in anything for years were drawn by the sound of singing. Within minutes, there were 8 elderly veterans in wheelchairs and on walkers gathered in Frank's doorway, all of them joining in the hymn that seemed to be healing something broken in each of them. The moment that changed everything was still coming. As the last notes of Amazing Grace faded, Frank looked directly at Whitney with eyes that were fully present for the first time in years. His mouth opened, and everyone held their breath, waiting to see if the miracle of speech would continue. "My squad," he whispered, his voice cracked but clear. "They ain't never coming home." The words hung in the air like a confession that had been 20 years in the making. Dr. Martinez understood immediately what was happening. Frank was finally able to voice the survivor's guilt that had been eating him alive since Vietnam. The guilt of making it home when so many of his younger soldiers hadn't. "Tell me about them," Whitney said gently, still holding his hands. "Bobby Martinez," Frank said, his voice getting stronger with each word. 19 years old, wanted to be a teacher. Tommy Chen, 21, had a baby girl he never got to meet. Danny Williams, 18, still had braces on his teeth when we shipped out. Whitney listened as Frank began to tell her about each member of his squad. Young men he'd tried to protect and lead safely through an impossible war. She learned that Frank had been the oldest soldier in his unit, a career military man who'd volunteered for Vietnam because he believed his experience could keep the younger soldiers alive. "I was supposed to bring them home," Frank said, tears flowing freely now. "That was my job, to keep those boys safe. And I failed. I came home and they didn't. I got to see my wife again, even if it was just for a few months before she passed, and they never got to see their families again." "Sergeant Peterson," Whitney said firmly, using his military title with respect, "you didn't fail anyone. War is hell, and sometimes good people don't make it home. That doesn't mean you failed. That means you survived something that was meant to destroy you, and you've spent 20 years carrying the memory of those boys with honor." What Frank said next revealed the true depth of his decades-long silence. "I stopped talking," Frank continued, "because every word felt like betrayal. How could I use my voice to sing, to laugh, to tell stories, when Bobby and Tommy and Danny would never speak again? How could I enjoy the gift of being alive when I couldn't save them?" Whitney understood immediately. Frank's silence hadn't been just about grief. It had been about guilt, about feeling unworthy of the basic human pleasures that death had denied to his fallen comrades. He'd spent 20 years in self-imposed exile from the world of the living because he felt he didn't deserve to be there. "Sergeant," Whitney said, and her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent her life understanding the power of the human voice. "Those boys didn't die so you could spend the rest of your life silent. They died so you could live, really live. And part of living is honoring their memory by using the voice they'll never have." Frank looked at her with an expression of wonder, as if he were seeing sunshine after 20 years of darkness. "You think," he said slowly, "you think they'd want me to sing again?" Whitney smiled through her tears. "I think they'd be honored to know that their sacrifice meant their sergeant's voice could bring comfort to other people. I think they'd want you to sing for all the soldiers who are still fighting their own silent battles." Dr. Martinez, who had been quietly taking notes throughout this extraordinary session, stepped forward. "Sergeant Peterson," she said, "you've just made more progress in 2 hours than we've achieved in 10 years of treatment. Would you be willing to work with Mrs. Houston to develop a music therapy program here at the hospital?" Frank looked from Dr. Martinez to Whitney, then back again. When he spoke, his voice was clear and strong, carrying the authority of a man who'd spent his life in service to others. "Ma'am," he said to Whitney, "if you're willing to come back and help some of these other veterans find their voices, I'd be honored to assist you. I think I've got about 20 years of words to catch up on, and maybe some songs to teach these young folks about what music meant to soldiers like us. Over the next 6 months, something extraordinary happened at the East Orange VA Medical Center. Whitney returned every Wednesday, always with her gospel hymn book, always ready to sit with veterans who'd lost their way in the darkness of trauma and war. Frank became her partner in this unofficial therapy, sharing stories of how music had sustained soldiers through the worst of times, teaching Whitney the songs that had meant the most to men facing death far from home. Together, they helped dozens of veterans rediscover their voices. Not just literally, though there were several cases of men who'd been selectively mute, finding speech again through song. But more importantly, they helped veterans find their voices in the larger sense. Their ability to tell their stories, to connect with their families, to believe that their lives had meaning beyond the wars they'd survived. Frank's daughter Susan, who hadn't visited in 3 years, received a phone call from Whitney personally. "Your father has been asking for you," Whitney told her. "He's ready to talk now. He's ready to be your dad again." The reunion between Frank and Susan was held in the hospital's newly established music therapy room, donated and equipped by Whitney's foundation. When Susan walked through the door, Frank stood up from his wheelchair, something he hadn't done under his own power in 5 years, and sang to her the lullaby he'd sung when she was a baby. "I'm sorry I went away," he told his daughter through tears. "I'm sorry I couldn't find my way back to you sooner. But I'm here now, and I want to tell you about the brave young men who died so that I could come home and be your father." The Whitney Houston Music Therapy Program at the East Orange VA Medical Center became a model for veteran treatment facilities across the country. Frank Peterson, who'd been silent for 20 years, became one of the program's most effective counselors, using his own story of healing to reach veterans that traditional therapy couldn't touch. But the most powerful moments happened during the weekly group sessions, when Whitney would sit at an old piano in the therapy room, and Frank would tell the stories of soldiers whose voices had been silenced by war. Then he would sing their favorite songs, the ones they'd hummed in foxholes and jungle clearings, the music that had kept them human in the most inhuman circumstances. "Every veteran has a song," Frank would tell new patients. "Sometimes we forget the words, sometimes we're afraid to sing, but the music is always there. Ms. Whitney here helped me remember that my voice isn't just mine. It belongs to every soldier who didn't make it home. When I sing, they sing with me." On Veterans Day 1992, exactly 1 year after Whitney's first visit, the hospital held its first annual memorial concert. Frank Peterson, now 85 and walking with just a cane, took the stage alongside Whitney Houston to perform Amazing Grace for an audience of veterans, their families, and the medical staff who'd witnessed countless miracles over the past 12 months. But before they sang, Frank stepped to the microphone with a confidence that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice clear and strong, "I want to tell you about some young men named Bobby Martinez, Tommy Chen, and Danny Williams. They died in Vietnam 40 years ago, but tonight they're going to sing again through our voices. Because that's what music does. It keeps the voices of the fallen alive in the hearts of those who survived." As Whitney's voice soared in harmony with Frank's weathered tenor, there wasn't a dry eye in the auditorium. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of healing, of recognition, of the powerful truth that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone isn't medicine or therapy or professional treatment. Sometimes the greatest gift is simply the belief that their voice matters, that their story deserves to be heard, and that the songs in their hearts are worth singing even after 20 years of silence. Frank Peterson lived another 8 years, serving as a music therapy counselor until the day he died peacefully in his sleep at age 93. At his funeral, Whitney Houston sang Amazing Grace one final time for her friend, and hundreds of veterans whom Frank had helped find their voices sang along. On his headstone, at Frank's request, were engraved the words, "Sergeant Frank Peterson. He found his voice so others could find theirs. In honor of Bobby Martinez, Tommy Chen, Danny Williams, and all who gave their voices so others could sing." The music therapy program that began with one silent soldier and one determined singer has now helped over 10,000 veterans rediscover their voices. And somewhere, in the space between heartbreak and healing, The songs of those who didn't make it home continue to echo in the voices of those who did. If this story of healing and the power of music moved you, please share it with a veteran who might need to hear that their voice matters. Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories about the miracles that happen when we refuse to give up on each other.